My brother told me our mother left me nothing. He said it gently, almost kindly, as if he were offering condolences instead of erasing me. We were standing in the hallway of the funeral home, the scent of lilies still clinging to our clothes. The carpet was a muted gray, soft beneath our feet, absorbing sound. Everything about that day felt hushed, even betrayal. "I'm sorry, Claire," Daniel said, pressing his hand briefly against my shoulder. "Mom wanted it this way." I blinked at him. "What do you mean?" I asked. "She updated the will last year," he continued, lowering his voice as though sharing something sacred. "She left the house, the savings, everything to me." Everything. The word echoed strangely in my chest. "That doesn't make sense," I said softly. "She would have told me." Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "She didn't want to hurt you," he replied. "She thought it was better if I handled things. Handled things. As if I were fragile. As if I hadn't been the one driving our mother to chemo appointments every Tuesday for 6 months. As if I hadn't been the one sitting beside her hospital bed at 3 in the morning when the pain medication wore off." The hallway felt suddenly too narrow. "Why?" I asked quietly. Daniel sighed, as though exhausted by my confusion. "You know Mom worried about you," he said. "After the divorce. After the business closed. She didn't think you were stable." Stable. I stood there, the funeral program crumpling slightly in my hand. Our mother had been gone less than 3 hours, and already I was being written out of her life. "I want to see it," I said. "The will?" "Yes." He hesitated just for a second. "It's with Mr. Henderson," he said finally. "We'll go over everything next week." Next week. My mother had once told me that grief makes time move differently. Some moments stretch endlessly. Others vanish before you can hold them. Standing there in that hallway, I felt both. I nodded slowly. "All right," I said. But something inside me, something quiet and steady, did not believe him. Before all of this, before the lilies and legal documents, before Daniel's careful tone, there was just our family. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. We grew up in the same small house on Maple Street, white siding, green shutters, a porch swing that creaked in the summer. Daniel was 3 years older than me, tall and confident even as a child. He was the one teachers praised, the one neighbors pointed to as promising. I was quieter, more observant. Our father died when I was 14. Daniel was 17. I remember the way he stood at the edge of the cemetery that day, jaw clenched, refusing to cry. I remember our mother holding my hand tightly, her wedding ring pressing into my skin. After that, it was just the 3 of us. Mom worked 2 jobs for years. She packed Daniel's lunches carefully, ironed his shirts before school interviews. She sat at the kitchen table helping me with algebra long after midnight. There was no favoritism in those days, least not that I saw. Daniel left for college first. Then came his job in finance. A house in the suburbs. A wife who wore tailored blazers and spoke quickly about investments. I stayed closer to home. Opened a small bookstore downtown. Married a man who loved poetry but hated stability. The marriage didn't last. The bookstore didn't either. When Mom got sick, I moved back into the Maple Street house. Daniel visited on weekends. Sometimes. He always brought expensive flowers. Sometimes wine. I brought soup. In time. Mom never said she favored one of us over the other. But in her final months, she held my hand more often than his. That's why Daniel's words in the funeral hallway didn't fit. It wasn't about the money. It was about being erased. The following Tuesday, I went to see Mr. Henderson alone. His office smelled faintly of old paper and lemon polish. The blinds were half drawn, casting thin lines of light across his desk. "Claire," he said gently, "I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you," I replied. I didn't sit immediately. "I'd like to see my mother's will," I said. He adjusted his glasses and reached for a folder in his cabinet. "There was a revision filed last April," he said carefully. "Your brother was present. Last April. That was during Mom's 3rd round of chemotherapy. She was very clear in her instructions," he added. My heart thudded once, slow and heavy. He opened the folder and turned the document toward me. The signature at the bottom was hers. At least it looked like hers. but something about it felt strained. The loops in her handwriting were tighter. The line beneath her name trembled slightly. She left everything to Daniel? I asked. Yes, Mr. Henderson replied. And she explained why? He hesitated. She stated that Daniel had been the primary financial supporter in recent years. Primary financial supporter. I stared at him. That's not true, I said quietly. He shifted in his chair. I can only go by what was documented. The room felt colder than it had a moment before. When was the previous will drafted? I asked. About 10 years ago, he said. At that time the estate was divided equally between you and your brother. Equally. The word steadied me. What happened to that version? I asked. It was superseded by the updated will. Of course it was. Legal language has a way of sounding clean even when something underneath is not. I folded my hands in my lap to stop them from trembling. Did she come here alone? I asked. Mr. Henderson paused. No, he admitted. Your brother accompanied her. I nodded slowly, and in that quiet office surrounded by tidy files and polite condolences, the first thread of doubt pulled tight in my chest. Because my mother had difficulty holding a pen by April. Her hands shook too much. And yet somehow she had signed away her daughter. On my way home from Mr. Henderson's office, I didn't turn on the radio. The silence suited me. The Maple Street house looked smaller somehow without my mother standing in the front window. She used to part the curtain just slightly whenever she heard my car pull in, pretending she wasn't watching. The porch swing moved gently in the breeze, though no one had touched it. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The house still carried her scent, lavender lotion and something faintly sweet, like baked apples. Grief has a way of lingering in the air, clinging to curtains and upholstery. I set my purse on the kitchen table and ran my fingers across the wood. The table bore the faint scratches from decades of use. Daniel carved his initials underneath it when he was 12. Mom pretended to scold him, but she never sanded them off. It wasn't just a house. It was our history. Daniel had called twice that morning. I let both calls go to voicemail. The messages were brief. Just checking in, he said the first time. Let me know when you want to talk about next steps, he added the second. Next steps. As though this were a business transition instead of a family fracture. I made myself tea and sat at the table, staring at the wall where Mom used to hang her calendar. She circled every birthday in red ink. Every appointment in blue. Last April. That date kept returning to me. I pulled open the drawer where she kept her mail and old receipts. Everything was neatly stacked, tied with rubber bands. Mom was never careless with paperwork. After half an hour of searching, I found a small notebook, the kind with a faded floral cover. She used it to jot down grocery lists and reminders. Flipping through the pages, I paused on an entry from April. Meeting with Henderson, Danny Handling. Danny Handling. The handwriting was shaky. I sat back slowly. Mom rarely referred to him as Danny in writing. That was something she said aloud with affection. Written down it felt different. Almost dictated. I closed the notebook and pressed it flat against the table. Maybe I was looking for ghosts. Grief makes you suspicious of everything. That afternoon, Daniel showed up unannounced. He walked in without knocking. He still had his old key. We need to talk, he said, removing his sunglasses. His suit jacket was tailored crisp. He looked like a man stepping into a boardroom, not his childhood kitchen. I went to see Mr. Henderson, I said calmly. He paused. You didn't need to do that. I wanted clarity. And you got it, he replied evenly. Mom changed her will. I studied his face. There was no visible guilt, just firmness. Why? I asked. He exhaled slowly. Claire. I've supported her financially for years. Property taxes. Medical bills. You know that. That's not true, I said quietly. I was here. Every day. You were living here, he corrected gently. That's not the same as contributing. The word stung more than I expected. I paid utilities, I replied. Groceries. I drove her to appointments. And I paid for the treatments your insurance wouldn't cover, he snapped. The first crack in his composure. We stood there, two adults in a kitchen that had once held bedtime stories and burnt cookies. She would have told me, I said softly. Daniel looked away briefly. She didn't want you to feel judged, he said. She thought it was easier this way. Easier for whom? Why didn't she tell me herself? I asked. He didn't answer. Instead, he walked to the window and stared out at the backyard. You can't keep the house, he said after a moment. I'm listing it next month. The words felt like a physical shove. You're what? It's the practical decision, he replied. The market's strong. I felt something cold slide down my spine. You've already decided? It's mine now, he said. Mine. The simplicity of it made my chest tighten. For years, Daniel had been the golden child. Not cruel, just ambitious. Focused on outcomes. On returns. But this felt different. This felt rushed. Give me some time, I said quietly, to sort through Mom's things. You have 30 days, he replied. 30 days. In the house where I learned to walk. Where I held my mother's hand as she took her last breath. He checked his watch. A subtle gesture that felt deliberate. I have a meeting, he added. Let me know if you need help packing. Packing. As if my life here were a temporary arrangement. After he left, I stood alone in the kitchen. The clock on the wall ticked steadily. Tick, tick, tick. Mom used to say that when something doesn't feel right, you should sit with it quietly. Truth doesn't rush, she'd tell me. But Daniel was rushing. Listing the house. Setting deadlines. Why? I walked down the hallway to Mom's bedroom. Her bed was still neatly made, the quilt smoothed flat. On her dresser sat a small jewelry box. The one she kept locked. I opened the top drawer carefully. Inside were old photographs. Dad in his work uniform. Daniel in his graduation cap. Me holding a book twice my size. Beneath the photos was a small envelope. Unsealed. My name written across the front in Mom's handwriting. My breath caught. It wasn't hidden deeply. Just tucked beneath memories. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened it slowly. Inside was a single folded page. Claire, it began. My hands trembled as I unfolded the rest. Claire. The letter began in my mother's familiar looping script. If you're reading this, it means I didn't get the chance to explain everything the way I wanted to. My throat tightened. The afternoon light filtered through the curtains, casting soft stripes across the bedspread. Dust floated gently in the air, visible in the stillness. I kept reading. Danny insists he's doing what's best. He worries about you. He worries about the house. He worries about appearances. I paused. Appearances. Your brother believes stability comes from control. You believe it comes from love. I wish you both could see how much you're alike. My hands began to tremble. I signed some papers last week. I wasn't feeling well, and he said it would make things easier. I trusted him. The words blurred slightly as tears gathered in my eyes. If anything feels wrong after I'm gone, don't ignore it. You've always had good instincts, Claire. Trust them. There was no mention of a will. No explanation. Just a quiet unease folded into ink. I sat there for a long time, staring at the final line. I love you equally. Always. Equally. The word settled into my chest like something solid. I folded the letter carefully and slid it back into the envelope. My name stared up at me as though daring me to look away. Danny insists he's doing what's best. He said almost the same thing in the funeral hallway. Coincidence, perhaps. Or rehearsal. I stood and walked to her dresser mirror. My reflection looked older than it had that morning. Grief and suspicion age you in different ways. One pulls downward, the other sharpens. If anything feels wrong after I'm gone, don't ignore it. The signature on the will had looked strained. Her hands had been shaking badly by April. I remembered it clearly. The way she struggled to hold her teacup steady. The way I'd wrapped both my hands around hers just to help her sip. And yet she had signed a legal document transferring everything. I picked up my phone and called the oncology nurse who had worked closely with Mom last spring. Hi, Susan, I said gently when she answered. I hope this isn't strange. But do you remember how Mom was doing in April? There was a pause. She was very weak by then, Susan replied softly. Her motor skills were declining. Would she have been able to sign paperwork confidently? Another pause. It would have been difficult, she admitted. Her hands trembled constantly. I closed my eyes. Thank you, I whispered. When I hung up, the house felt quieter than ever. Danny insists he's doing what's best. Best for whom? That evening, I went into the small study where Dad used to keep financial records. The filing cabinet was still there, gray, dented at the corner. I opened it slowly. Mom had kept everything organized. Property tax receipts, utility bills, bank statements. I pulled out last year's statements. Daniel had been transferring money into Mom's account regularly. That part was true. But I also noticed something else. Large withdrawals. Checks written in Daniel's name. Some labeled consulting. Consulting for what? Mom had never needed financial consulting from her own son. I sat back in Dad's old leather chair and stared at the paper spread across the desk. The pattern wasn't loud. It was subtle. But it was there. Money flowing in and flowing back out. I took photos of the statements with my phone. Not because I wanted a fight, but because something no longer felt accidental. The next morning Daniel called again. "Have you thought about moving?" he asked without greeting. "I found a letter Mom wrote me," I said. There was a pause. "What letter?" "She mentioned signing papers in April. She didn't specify what." Another pause, longer this time. "She was confused toward the end," he said carefully. "You know that." "She wasn't confused," I replied softly. "She was tired." "Claire," he sighed. "Don't do this." "Do what?" "Turn this into something ugly." "Ugly?" "Truth often looks ugly before it looks clear." "I'm not turning anything," I said. "I'm asking questions." He didn't respond. "I also reviewed some bank statements," I added. His voice sharpened slightly. "You went through her files? I live here. That doesn't give you the right to audit me." "Audit?" Such a telling word. "I'm not accusing you," I said calmly. "But I am concerned." He exhaled loudly. "This is exactly why Mom made the decision she did," he said. "You can't handle conflict without spiraling. The old narrative. Claire is unstable. Claire is emotional." It was subtle, but it had always lingered beneath the surface. "I'm not spiraling," I replied evenly. "I'm paying attention." He went quiet again. "I'll have my attorney handle further communication," he said finally. My stomach dropped. "Your brother believes stability comes from control." The letter's words echoed in my mind. "Danny," I said softly, using the name Mom wrote. There was a flicker in his breath. "Yes. If there's nothing to hide, then transparency shouldn't scare you." He hung up. I stared at the silent phone in my hand. For years, Daniel had been the responsible one, the successful one, the steady one. I had been the softer one, the emotional one. But softness does not mean blindness. And grief does not erase instinct. I gathered the bank statements, the letter, and the copy of the will from Mr. Henderson. Then I drove back to his office. When he saw me walk in again, his brows lifted slightly. "Claire, I need to ask you something difficult," I said. He gestured for me to sit. "Were there witnesses present when Mom signed the revised will?" "Yes," he said carefully. "2 staff members." "Did she read it herself?" He hesitated. "Your brother summarized it for her," he admitted. "Summarized? Did she ask questions?" "I don't recall." The room felt very still. "And were you aware of the withdrawals from her account labeled consulting?" I asked quietly. His posture shifted. "No. I think you should be." I placed the bank statements on his desk. He studied them in silence. Then he looked up at me. "This may warrant further review," he said carefully. Further review. Legal language again. But this time it felt like a door cracking open. As I walked out of his office, I realized something important. Daniel had counted on grief to keep me quiet. He had counted on shame to keep me small. But my mother had left me something far more valuable than property. She had left me permission to question. And I intended to use it. 3 days later, Mr. Henderson called me. His voice was measured but different. "Claire," he said, "I've reviewed the documents again. There are irregularities." I stood in the kitchen, staring at the yellowed wallpaper my mother refused to replace. "What kind of irregularities?" I asked. "The witnesses who signed the April will have both left the firm," he replied. "One unexpectedly. The other relocated without notice. My grip tightened around the phone. And the signature? I pressed. There's noticeable variation compared to her prior documents, he admitted carefully. It could be attributed to illness. But paired with the financial transfers, he paused. It raises concern. Concern. A polite word for something that felt like betrayal crawling through my veins. Is it possible the will was altered? I asked. He did not answer immediately. It's possible undue influence occurred, he said finally. Undue influence. The legal phrasing felt clinical, but the meaning was clear. Someone had pushed. Someone had guided. Someone had benefited. I thanked him and ended the call slowly. Then I sat down at the kitchen table, the same one where Daniel and I once argued over who would wash dishes. Memories have a way of resurfacing when trust fractures. I remembered April vividly now. Daniel had insisted on driving Mom to the lawyer's office alone. She doesn't need both of us hovering, he'd said lightly. I had stayed home believing him, believing that family doesn't require supervision. That evening when they returned, Mom looked exhausted. I asked how it went. Productive, Daniel had answered before she could speak. Mom had smiled faintly and squeezed my hand. She's tired, he'd added quickly. And I had let it go. I stood and walked into Mom's bedroom again. Her jewelry box still sat on the dresser. This time I examined it more closely. Inside, beneath the pearl earrings she wore every Sunday, was a folded bank withdrawal slip. Dated April. The amount matched one of the larger checks Daniel had written to himself. My pulse quickened. Mom had always balanced her checkbook meticulously. She wouldn't have written vague, consulting notes. I opened the closet and looked through the small safe on the top shelf, the one Dad installed years ago. It was unlocked. Inside were insurance papers, the deed to the house, and something else. A thin folder labeled estate. My breath caught. I opened it carefully. Inside was a copy of the original will from 10 years ago, dividing everything equally. Signed confidently. Witnessed properly. Dated. Stamped. Why would Mom keep the old will separate from the new one? Unless she hadn't fully agreed. Unless she hadn't trusted what had been done. My hands trembled as I held the paper. Daniel had not just inherited everything. He had orchestrated it. That evening I drove to his house. The suburban street was immaculate. Trimmed hedges, symmetrical lawns, decorative wreath on the front door. His wife, Marissa, answered when I knocked. Her smile faded slightly when she saw me. Claire, she said cautiously. Is Daniel home? She hesitated. Yes. He appeared behind her moments later. His expression hardened immediately. What are you doing here? He asked. We need to talk, I said. He stepped outside, closing the door behind him. I spoke to Mr. Henderson, I began calmly. He didn't respond. I also found the original will, I added. His jaw tightened. Claire, did you pressure her? I asked quietly. The question hung between us. No, he said immediately. Did you summarize the document for her instead of letting her read it? She was too weak. Did you explain that she was disinheriting her daughter? His voice rose slightly. She understood. Did she? Silence. A long, unbearable silence. Neighbors walked dogs down the sidewalk, oblivious to the quiet war unfolding on the driveway. She wanted stability, he said finally. She didn't trust you with property management. That's not what her letter says. His eyes flickered. What letter? She wrote that you insisted it was best. He looked away. You're twisting things, he muttered. I'm uncovering them. His composure cracked then. I handled her finances because you couldn't, he snapped. Because someone had to be the adult. The word struck deeper than I expected. I was there every day, I said softly. You were there for paperwork. And paperwork matters, he shot back. Taxes matter. Assets matter. And integrity doesn't? I asked quietly. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. You wouldn't understand, he muttered. There it was again. The old narrative. Claire doesn't understand. Claire isn't stable. Claire can't manage. You withdrew money from her account, I said evenly. Under vague descriptions. You guided her through a will change while she was medicated. And now you're rushing to sell the house. His face flushed. I invested that money, he said defensively. For growth. In your name. It was temporary. Temporary until she died? The silence that followed felt heavier than any accusation. He looked smaller then, not physically but morally. I deserved more, he said finally, almost under his breath. The confession wasn't loud, but it was real. You deserved more? I repeated softly. I sacrificed things, he said. Opportunities. I paid bills you didn't. So you took what wasn't solely yours? His shoulders sagged. It wasn't theft, he insisted weakly. Then why hide it? He didn't answer. The truth rarely announces itself with drama. Sometimes it slips out in a single sentence. I deserved more. That was the core of it. Not necessity. Not stability. Entitlement. I'm contesting the will, I said calmly. His head snapped up. You'll lose. Maybe, I replied. But I won't stay silent. He stared at me for a long moment. Then, for the first time in our lives, Daniel looked uncertain. Because control thrives in silence. And I had just taken that away. The day I filed the petition to contest the will, it rained. Not dramatically. Not in sheets of thunder and lightning. Just a steady, quiet rain that blurred the courthouse windows and softened the edges of everything. Felt fitting. Grief and conflict don't always explode. Sometimes they settle in and soak through you slowly. My attorney, Ms. Alvarez, was a woman in her early 50s with sharp eyes and a voice that didn't rise unless absolutely necessary. You understand this won't be easy, she said gently as we reviewed the documents in her office. Undue influence cases require proof. Medical records, financial inconsistencies, witness testimony. I'm not afraid of difficult, I replied. I surprised myself with how steady I sounded. For years, Daniel had carried the image of being the capable one. The responsible one. The one who handled things. But handling things and handling them ethically are not the same. Ms. Alvarez tapped the bank statements thoughtfully. These withdrawals are significant, she said. And the timing aligns with the will revision. She was heavily medicated that month, I added. Her nurse confirmed she struggled to sign even small documents. That helps, she said. Especially if we can demonstrate dependency. Dependency. It was an uncomfortable word. But illness creates vulnerability. And vulnerability can be exploited. The legal notice was served to Daniel 3 days later. He called me within the hour. You're really doing this? He demanded. Yes. You're dragging Mom's name through court. No, I replied calmly. I'm protecting it. There was silence on the other end. You're going to ruin our relationship, he said finally. Our relationship changed the day you decided I didn't deserve honesty, I answered softly. He hung up without another word. The weeks that followed were a strange mixture of paperwork and memory. I spent hours gathering medical records, scanning documents, recounting conversations from April and sworn statements. It felt surreal to reduce my mother's final months into evidence. But sometimes love requires documentation. Daniel, in response, hired a high-profile attorney. The tone shifted quickly. Emails became formal. Accusations subtle but sharp. They claimed I had been financially dependent on Mom. That I benefited from living rent-free. That I lacked the experience to manage inherited property. The old narrative again. Unstable. Incapable. Irresponsible. Ms. Alvarez placed one such email in front of me and raised an eyebrow. He's building a character argument, she said. Of course he is, I replied quietly. Because when facts wobble, people attack perception. The deposition was scheduled for late summer. Daniel and I sat across from each other in a sterile conference room. Water pitchers sweating onto polished wood. He avoided my eyes at first. His attorney spoke smoothly, rehearsed. Miss Carter, she said to me. Isn't it true that you struggled financially after your bookstore closed? Yes, I replied calmly. And that your mother covered certain expenses during that period? She offered help, I corrected gently. As mothers do. Would it be fair to say you were dependent on her? No, I said evenly. I was present. The distinction hung in the air. Daniel shifted in his seat. When it was his turn to answer questions, Miss Alvarez leaned forward slightly. Mr. Carter, she began, why did you write checks to yourself labeled consulting from your mother's account? For financial management, he said quickly. Were those services requested in writing? No. Was there a contract? No. Did your mother sign authorization for those specific withdrawals? She trusted me. Trust. The word felt heavy in the room. Is it accurate that she was undergoing chemotherapy during this time? Ms. Alvarez continued. Yes. And that her motor control was impaired? Yes. And yet you summarized the will revision to her rather than allowing her to read it independently? She was tired. Did she request that you speak on her behalf? Silence. I don't recall, he muttered. The court reporter's keys clicked softly, capturing every hesitation, every pause. That was the thing about truth. It doesn't shout. It waits for someone to listen closely. After the deposition, Daniel caught up to me in the hallway. You're humiliating us, he said quietly. I'm asking for fairness, I replied. You don't understand the pressure I was under, he insisted. The bills. The stress. I understand pressure, I said softly. I held her hand when she was afraid of dying. He flinched. You think I didn't care? He asked. I think you cared, I answered. But you also calculated. The words were not cruel. They were precise. He looked at me then, truly looked at me, perhaps for the first time in years. I thought I was protecting the estate, he said quietly. From what? He didn't answer. Because the truth was simpler. He had been protecting his version of stability. Control feels safe, even when it costs someone else their share. The trial date was set for November. In the weeks leading up to it, I spent more time in the Maple Street house, sorting through Mom's belongings slowly. I found old letters she'd written to both of us as children, notes tucked into recipe books, a birthday card Daniel gave her one year that read, I'll always take care of you. Perhaps he had meant it. Perhaps somewhere along the way taking care turned into taking over. The night before court, I sat alone on the porch swing. The air was crisp. Leaves gathered at the edge of the yard. I wasn't fighting for money. I was fighting for recognition, for equality, for the simple truth that my mother loved us both, and that love should not be rewritten by convenience. The next morning, I walked into the courtroom not as the unstable daughter my brother described, but as the woman my mother believed I was, capable, perceptive, and no longer willing to be silent. Courtrooms are colder than they look on television. The air feels thinner somehow, as if even breathing must be measured. I sat beside Miss Alvarez at the long wooden table, my hands folded neatly in my lap. Daniel sat across from me, his posture rigid, his suit immaculate. Marissa was seated behind him, her face composed but pale. The Maple Street house, our childhood, had become a case file. The judge entered quietly. We stood. We sat. And then the unraveling began. Miss Alvarez opened calmly, methodically laying out the timeline. Mom's declining health, the financial withdrawals, the revised will signed under questionable circumstances. No dramatics. Just facts. When it was my turn to testify, I walked to the stand with steady steps. The oath felt heavier than I expected. Miss Carter, Miss Alvarez began gently, can you describe your involvement in your mother's care during her final year? I lived with her, I said. I drove her to chemotherapy. I managed her medications. I stayed overnight at the hospital when her fever spiked. My voice didn't tremble. I had lived those moments. They were real. And were you aware of the will revision in April? No, I replied. I learned of it after her funeral. A murmur moved faintly through the room. Did your mother ever express a desire to disinherit you? Never, I said quietly. Then Daniel's attorney stood. Miss Carter, she began smoothly. Isn't it true you experienced financial hardship after your business closed? Yes. And that your mother provided you housing? Yes. So would it surprise you if she felt your brother was better suited to manage her estate? I paused. It would surprise me if she chose management over fairness, I said calmly. A slight tightening in the attorney's jaw. When Daniel took the stand, I watched him carefully. He looked confident at first. Controlled. But under questioning, control began to thin. Mr. Carter, Ms. Alvarez said, Did you advise your mother to revise her will? Yes, he admitted. Why? I believed it was prudent. For whom? For the estate. Or for yourself? His lips pressed thin. I invested money for growth, he said. I ensured stability. Did your mother request those investments? She trusted me. Did she authorize withdrawals in writing? No. Did you inform your sister of the will revision? No. Why not? She didn't need to know. The courtroom felt very quiet. Didn't need to know. The judge leaned forward slightly. Mr. Carter, she said, why did you feel your sister did not need to know she was being excluded from her mother's will? Daniel hesitated. She reacts emotionally, he said carefully. And you felt that justified withholding information? The judge asked. Silence. He swallowed. I thought it was best. There it was again. Best. The word had become his shield. After closing arguments, the judge recessed for deliberation. The waiting was unbearable. I sat alone on a bench outside the courtroom, listening to the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. My palms were damp. My heart felt strangely calm, because regardless of outcome, the truth had been spoken aloud. When we were called back in, Daniel avoided looking at me. The judge's voice was measured. Based on the evidence presented, she began, this court finds substantial indication of undue influence and financial mismanagement. My breath caught. The revised will dated April is hereby invalidated. The original will dividing the estate equally between the siblings stands. For a moment I didn't move. The words settled slowly. Equal. Fair. Restored. The judge continued. Additionally, the court orders a forensic audit of the financial withdrawals. Daniel's shoulders dropped slightly. It wasn't triumph I felt. It was release. Outside the courtroom, reporters were absent. There was no spectacle. Just family. Marissa approached me quietly. I didn't know about the withdrawals, she said softly. I believed her. Daniel stood a few feet away, staring at the floor. When he finally met my eyes, something in his expression had shifted. Not anger. Not defiance. Something closer to exhaustion. I didn't think it would go this far, he said quietly. It went this far the day you decided I wasn't equal, I replied. He nodded slowly. I was afraid you'd lose the house, he admitted. Or mismanage it. You never asked me, I said gently. That was the heart of it. He had assumed incapacity instead of offering partnership. Control instead of trust. The forensic audit later confirmed that while Daniel had not outright stolen funds, he had blended investments improperly, prioritizing his accounts before reimbursing hers. He was required to repay the discrepancies with interest. It wasn't prison. It wasn't public disgrace. It was accountability. Word spread quietly among extended family. Some cousins reached out in support. Others remained distant. But something important had shifted. Daniel was no longer the unquestioned executor of decisions. He was simply human. Flawed. Fallible. As we walked down the courthouse steps together, neither of us spoke. The air was cool. Crisp. Autumn had fully arrived. For the first time in months I felt steady. Not because I had one, but because I had refused to disappear. Justice does not always roar. Sometimes it simply corrects. And correction when it comes can feel like dignity restored. The Maple Street house didn't feel victorious after the ruling. It felt quiet. Justice restores balance, but it does not erase history. The first evening after court, I sat alone at the kitchen table. The same table where Daniel and I once built towers from sugar cubes and argued over homework. The walls hadn't changed. But something inside me had. The house was legally half mine again. Half his. Equal. The word felt steady now, not fragile. Daniel didn't come by for several days. When he finally did, he knocked. That alone felt significant. I opened the door slowly. He stood on the porch without his suit jacket this time. No polished shoes. Just jeans and a worn sweater I hadn't seen in years. Can I come in? He asked quietly. I stepped aside. We sat at the kitchen table in silence for a few moments. I've been thinking, he began. About Dad. About Mom. I didn't interrupt. I always felt like I had to hold everything together after Dad died. He continued. Be the strong one. The responsible one. You were 17, I said softly. He nodded. And you were 14, he replied. For the first time I saw the boy he used to be, not the financial advisor, not the executor. Just my brother. I thought if I controlled things nothing would fall apart, he said quietly. Not money. Not assets. And what about people? I asked gently. He didn't answer right away. I didn't think you'd fight back, he admitted finally. The honesty surprised me. Why not? He shrugged slightly. You've always been the softer one. Soft. The word had followed me my whole life. Soft doesn't mean weak. It means aware. I'm still soft, I said quietly. I just learned how to stand. He nodded. I'm sorry, he said then. Not defensively. Not strategically. Just simply. I studied his face carefully. Apologies don't erase action, but they can open space. What are you going to do about the house? He asked. I'd like to keep it, I replied. At least for now. He looked around slowly. It needs work. So do we, I said softly. A faint, reluctant smile touched his mouth. In the weeks that followed, we agreed on terms. Daniel would transfer full ownership of the house to me in exchange for his share of the liquid assets. It wasn't a dramatic reconciliation. It was practical, balanced. He began attending financial ethics counseling voluntarily, something suggested during the audit process. Not because he was forced, but because, perhaps for the first time, he understood the cost of unchecked control. We didn't return to being childhood versions of ourselves. Some fractures leave lines. But we learned how to speak without rehearsed narratives, without labeling each other as stable or unstable. One afternoon months later, Daniel came over with a toolbox. The porch swings loose, he said. We worked side by side in quiet rhythm. The scent of fresh cut wood mixed with autumn air. At one point he paused. You know, he said, tightening a bolt, Mom would have hated all of this. Yes, I replied gently. But she would have hated silence more. That was the lesson I carried forward. Silence protects the wrong things. It protects imbalance. Protects assumption. Protects entitlement. Speaking, even when uncomfortable, protects dignity. The Maple Street house slowly became mine in more than paperwork. I repainted the kitchen a soft cream, replaced the worn curtains, turned Dad's old study into a small reading room. Not because I wanted to erase the past, but because I wanted to shape the future without fear of being written out of it. Daniel and I never became inseparable again, but we became honest. And sometimes that is enough. One evening, as I sat on the porch swing watching the sun dip behind the trees, I unfolded Mom's letter again. If anything feels wrong after I'm gone, don't ignore it. I smiled faintly. I hadn't ignored it. Not for money. Not for pride. But for equality. For the simple truth that love should not be rearranged for convenience. The house creaked gently in the evening breeze. Stable. Not because someone controlled it, but because fairness held it upright. And in the quiet that followed, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Peace. The emotional arc has reached closure. You know, when my brother told me Mom left me nothing, it wasn't the money that hurt. It was the erasing. The quiet assumption that I could be written out of a life I helped build. That my presence, my care, my years beside her bedside could be reduced to unstable or not capable. Grief is heavy enough without having to defend your worth at the same time. I could have walked away. I could have said, it's just property. But sometimes it's not about property. Sometimes it's about principle. About standing up and saying I was here. I mattered. I am equal. What I learned through all of this is something simple but powerful. Control can look like responsibility. Silence can look like peace. But neither one guarantees fairness. Speaking up doesn't always mean you're angry. Sometimes it just means you're no longer willing to disappear. Daniel and I will never be exactly who we were before. But we are honest now. And honesty, even when it arrives late, has a way of restoring balance. So let me ask you something gently. If someone tried to rewrite your place in your own family story, would you stay quiet? Or would you stand? Tell me in the comments. I read more than you think. And if this story reminded you that dignity is worth defending, consider subscribing. There's always another story waiting. And sometimes, it begins with a single question you refuse to ignore.